All right, good afternoon, everyone. So this is a hard act to follow in the sense that I don't have research. I'm going to be talking about everything but research. I'm going to be talking about teaching and service. I kind of see them as all the same thing. That's kind of going to be the theme of what I'm going to be talking about today. So when I think about this, I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm old enough that I can be a storyteller at this point. I'm going to tell you about what I'm about as a person who happens to be a thinker and who works in thinking organizations, actually a whole bunch of them, and how my approach to thinking about thinking and seeing service as being super important informs conversations about democracy. And I think all of that, to me, is a moral obligation. I'll talk about that towards the end. So what am I about? I work at Penn State. They pay me primarily. Penn State loaned me out to the RAND Corporation. I work there too. At the RAND Corporation, I do a bunch of stuff on misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. To be honest with you, I don't care what the terms are. The idea is this, that if you buy this metaphor, we are in an ecosystem of information. And it's a really complicated ecosystem. There are lots of moving parts to the ecosystem. Can y'all hear me? Is my voice carrying? Okay. Again, put a little higher, yeah. And because it's a delicate ecosystem, messing with one part of that ecosystem can have downstream negative impacts on other parts of that ecosystem. I study, if you want to think of it very generally, what we can do to maintain and improve the integrity of that information ecosystem. Now, what they call that at RAND is I am their distinguished chair for countering truth decay. Truth decay was their term they made up. I like it, but then I've noticed that these days, terms get politicized, and so I don't need that term to do the work that I'm doing. And that's part of what I'm doing now. So I think of myself as the information ecosystem guy, but really, I'm the depolarization guy. Really, I'm trying to figure out the idea that if you use that phrase truth decay, truth has been decayed at this point. What Rand describes that is the decline in the importance of analysis and evidence and expertise in American life. I don't need to convince y'all that the value of expertise and analysis and information in American life is under attack. And as a person who gets paid in thinking organizations, that's just bad for business. So as a person who's a thinker who works in thinking organizations, I've been thinking a whole lot about what I can do as a person in my set of circumstances to be part of whatever the solution is going to be. So what I've been up to lately is I've just been leaning into the fact that as a thinker, I can model good behavior. And as a person who benefits from being in classrooms, I like to think that classrooms offer me an opportunity to practice some of the things that I preach. I think about classrooms as being laboratories for democracy work. I had been thinking about that for years, but hadn't had the vocabulary to actually characterize things that way. But then very recently developed the vocabulary to do so. Actually convinced a journal of political science education to publish something that talks about this very thing. And so that you don't have to read that thing, the idea behind it is that as laboratories of democracy, I see thinking and knowledge providing and space holding as democracy work. What do I mean by that? I think trust is the currency of the classroom. If you, for example, don't give off the vibe that you are sincerely interested in what your students are going through on their intellectual journey, it's hard to have a good class. If the students in those classrooms don't feel like their opinions are going to be treated with the kind of dignity that they need to be treated with, if the students are in very entrenched positions because they have sources that give them things that they are very attached to, and they may not necessarily feel comfortable being challenged when it comes to the things that they hold dear, if you don't give the environment that kind of care, and if you don't come into that circumstance with the kind of intellectual honesty and authenticity, and from time to time, ability and willingness to be vulnerable in front of your students, then you're not going to get what you want to get fully out of the classroom. If I'm talking to professors, y'all know this already. I just realized that over the years how important that actually turns out to be. primarily because, strangely enough, people get super emotional in my classes. And it's part of what I do. I'm a political scientist. We argue. That's kind of our pedagogy, if you want to think about it that way. But we argue about policy a lot of times. And some of my colleagues will make the mistake of thinking debates about policy are just that. But a debate about policy can be a debate about identity. And if you, for example, were to do a debate bro format for something like the topic of immigration, you might get very interesting comments from students on both sides of the political aisle, and you might get some hurt feelings. And I've had on multiple occasions, not because I wanted to, but because it happened, students break down into tears in my classroom. I'm not going to lie to you. I've broken down into tears in my own classroom. Like, this stuff is hard. And I think emotions are data. So the way that someone might try to minimize an intense emotional event in a class, I've learned to be comfortable enough with them that I can actually learn from them, and I can use them as evidence for others in the classroom as well. I'm not saying that I'm an emotional scholar or anything like that, but I do think that these are moments that, if done right, and done right is a very loose way of thinking about it, if these are moments where if you care enough to be brave enough and to be conscientious enough, these moments can actually lead to real learning. I think some of the best learning that happens in college courses happens when somebody's not 100% comfortable with what's going on. And a lot of times that somebody is me. A lot of times when I'm doing the work that I'm supposed to be doing as a teacher, I am not comfortable at all. I am off my game. I am concerned about the topic. I'm worried about whether or not I'm reaching everybody fully. I'm stressed out. I'm doing the things that you would do in an environment where you're trying to survive. And I'm not saying that's a positive thing, but I feel like that's okay if at the end of the day, the student benefits more from it than I feel uncomfortable about it. So that's another thing. Emotions are data. I like student-centered learning. This comes from my background in the piece that I got in the Journal of Political Science Education. I talk about how I came into this. Long story short, I was the least likely person you would expect to get a PhD and to be working at a Research One university. I grew up in a world where intellectual pursuits were laughed at. And I grew up in a world where crime and chaos were the norm, and calmness and steadiness were the exception. One joke I'll tell you is that when I was in high school, I was given an award for getting a 4.0 for the semester. And then that same very day, I was suspended from school for getting into a fist fight with a classmate because my classmate was teasing me about getting straight A's, right? So this is the kind of environment that I'm coming from. But I had people along the way that were willing to be vulnerable with me, people that cared enough to be uncomfortable with me, and people who cared enough to see through whatever it was I was going through and to realize my potential to get me to the place to where not only I could be okay being a learner and a thinker, but also to thrive in those environments too. I owe those folks, which is the reason why I'm here. I'm here because people paid attention to me, were caring enough to me, and held a space for me. And I can't pay those folks back, but I can pay it forward, so my job is to hold that space too. And finally, I think of classrooms as these sanctuaries, like they're spaces where it's okay to practice this stuff. And I use the word practice on purpose, because we're going to screw it up. You're going to say the wrong thing. You're going to fumble. You're going to misread a room. You're going to misread the people around you. You're going to overreact. There's going to be all of these things that don't look good in real time. But if you come into these spaces with the right attitude, the attitude is that you can play with these things. You can be vulnerable. You can mess up and make messes, and then you can clean them up because everybody understands the goal of it is to get better collectively. And so I take my classrooms as opportunities to do exactly what I'm describing to you here. How does that look? A lot of times it's me being extraordinarily vulnerable in class. It's also me trying to take a step back as a teacher and think really hard about what it is that students want. And it's me giving students the opportunity to engage in and struggle with not only the topics that we're talking about, but also how those topics make you feel, how those topics encourage you or not to think about the circumstances that other people might be in, and when possible, how different the world would be if your worldview was slightly different from the worldview that you came into the classroom with. All of that stuff sucks, but it's part of the job. It's part of the reason why I do it, because I want to make sure that I give this to students and I give students the opportunity to see that it's okay to be that way in a classroom. All right, so I talked about what I'm about, what I've been up to these days in terms of doing democracy work in the classroom and being in the knowledge business. If you leave out of here with anything, this is just what I want you to think. I want you to think back to what I said about how important trust is. If you can create a trusting environment in a classroom, I think that you've won. They might not remember any of the topics that you talk about in the class, but they might remember that they felt like you were giving them a chance to be whoever they are and to really deal with topics, and that was a good thing for them. Also, because I'm thinking about this in terms of both my job at Penn State and RAND, I just think of information as an inherently social enterprise. To be very symbolic about it, there are senders and receivers, right? If information is social, we should understand that disinformation is social, malinformation, false and misleading information, truth decay, whatever your catchphrase, those things are social too. I believe that if we're going to inform people, we might have to get people to pivot off of ideas that they currently have. I think fact-checking only works so far. You could, for example, tell someone that what they believe, what story they think is really important is not accurate, and they're just going to not listen to you. What's really important is you understand the communities that people come from that make the stories that they believe important to them. In other words, fact-checking as a way of like trying to counter pieces of non-facts with facts is a useful tool, but I think trying to understand the circumstances that people are in is a more important tool than just fact-checking. And so I spend a lot of time in my classrooms building a community, because if there is a community in the classroom, people can depart from their other communities while they're in that community, and maybe more movement can happen in there. And so I'm thinking about this in terms of how this relates to this conference. I feel a moral obligation to be a provider of that kind of space. It's important to me that I work in a sanctuary that does democracy work. It's also important to me that the students that deal with me feel like they are in a sanctuary like that too. And because that stuff is really important, I think of classrooms as mini communities. And I think community work is extremely important for two reasons, by the way. I think that trust as a concept is probably stronger at local/community levels than it is at what I'm going to call societal/governmental levels. So if you want to cash in on the reservoir of trust, it's probably easier to do so if you put your focus at the neighborhood level or the community level. In my case, the Penn State community in general and the classrooms that I sit in particular. If you're going to move anything, you can move stuff there. I am not cynical, but I'm not holding my breath that we are going to make policy changes at the federal government level that are going to facilitate the kind of depolarization that I think we need. And so I don't spend a whole lot of time working there. I spend a whole lot of time doing depolarization work at the community level. Not shown here is that the borough does Dignity Day every year. The Dignity Day celebrations are something I'm also a part of, not as a faculty member, but as a member of the community. And I was recently recognized for some of the volunteer work that I do for the borough when it comes to trying to encourage the very things that I'm talking about here. All this is to say is that democracies require us. There's probably some really catchy catchphrase I can give you from one of the framers of the Constitution, whatever. The whole point of this is that the buildings and the institutions aren't what democracy is. The interactions that people like you and I have are what democracy is. Democracy will rise or fall based on what we do. Now, that's a whole lot of pressure. Some people hear that and they get really afraid. I hear that and I get kind of inspired because that means that if it's up to us, we can decide what to do next. This is what I decide to do. Thank you.
About 10 minutes for questions. Yeah, I'll do Brian and Kathy.
Good afternoon. First of all, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to see if I could pick your brain in terms of how do we create brave spaces and not safe spaces in classrooms. In public administration, we make a distinction between the two. Okay. A brave space is when you bring your authentic self into it, right? All about suspending judgment, extending grace. Have you kind of mastered how to do that where students really come as they truly are? Instead of sometimes right now, I think I know where I am, sometimes students can kind of keep things a little bit to themselves instead of really engaging in a true dialogue, speaking across those differences that they might have that could be somewhat constructive. I try to kind of get people to kind of think about this quote, to bring comfort to the afflicted, you got to afflict the comfortable, right? But how have you done that within your environment, your classrooms?
So I'll be the first to tell you, I haven't figured it out, but I'm going to use an analogy for you. So like when my daughter's here, my daughter's 10 years old. When we were prepping to become parents, because my wife and I are both faculty members here at Penn State, we're thinkers. So we read all these books about parenting, and they didn't help. But eventually, we learned that, we kind of realized that it's not so much that we were prepping really hard to become parents. We were the kind of people that would prep to become parents. And that's like the sign that you're going to be okay as a parent, right? So I fail a lot in my classrooms. I try stuff that doesn't work, but I keep trying. Not because I think that trying for trying's sake is going to do it, but I just want to make sure that it's clear in all of my classrooms, I'm the kind of person that won't stop until I get to the point to where the classroom collectively feels like we can move forward together. That may happen in a semester, it may not happen in a semester, but it won't be for me not trying. And I think what anyone does is going to have to be unique to their personality and unique to their temperament. So I use a combination of self-deprecation and humor in my classrooms. I'm not as professional as maybe some of my colleagues are in terms of my presentation in my classroom, but that works for me. Somebody else might try that and they might get written up for it. I would say that you should just think about like the general idea that you want to be a good steward in your classroom. And being a good steward is worth way more than anything that you were coming into the classroom with. So my lecture notes take a backseat to the collective learning. My comfort takes a backseat to the collective learning. My preferences for how I deal with people take a backseat to whatever the collective preference is in the classroom. And because of that, that means I do a ton of adjusting over the course of my time. Not because it's an accessibility thing where I want everybody to move forward, but because I want people to see in real time, the students in the classroom, that I am the kind of person that wants to adjust things to the point to where like everybody will get an opportunity to get something out of it. I know this doesn't help, but I figured I'll answer it that way. Thank you.
It essentially was Brian's question, but on the heels of Mary Beth's presentation about inspiring messages, this was really, really inspiring.
Thank you.
But I do think you hit the nail on the head. The trickiest thing is the fear factor. I feel like I've been teaching for a while, and the hesitation, reluctance for kids to be honest and state their views has, I've never seen it be higher. And you helped, just now helped, articulate some of the ways in which you try to perhaps allay their fears that they have, probably I would suspect not so much with you, but with each other.
Each other, yeah.
I'll just end by saying thank you very much for a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you also. And so now I want to echo, I guess, hi, Brian. I'm Michelle. And Kathy, hi. So fine, then I want to echo both of my colleagues and also say, could you please follow up with some specifics? I'm also an adjuster and I share some of your values and I'm so excited that you're here as a faculty member and I will follow up with you in this as well. But if you have, specific strategies and examples of how you adjust and also those moments when you were uncomfortable and you sat in the discomfort, if you have like anything specific you could share. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, so I'll share with you the first time students cried in the classroom I was in. So I was at Florida State, it was before I got here. And I was teaching an intro to American federal government. It's a standard class in political science. I'm a political scientist. And the book I was using had debates in it. And the week that we were in was debate over immigration. Now, I'm in Tallahassee, Florida. The topic is immigration, and I went in there completely flat-footed. I thought that you would just go in there and be like, these are some arguments for looser immigration policies, and these are some arguments against looser immigration policies. And students did not see that the way that I did. Students got mad. Some students felt attacked because the conversation went into people who speak Spanish and whether they belong in the country. That conversation led to name calling. That name calling led to hurt feelings. Those hurt feelings led to some students walking out and some students crying and me losing complete control over the class. Now, I had just started out. I had just got my PhD. That's my first R1 job. I was worried I was screwing it up. So I went away feeling kind of unmoored and uncertain about what to do next. But it was my job to come back the next class session and figure out how to move forward. So we basically scrapped the entire lesson. And we just spent the whole meeting like basically doing an intervention. I had to apologize because I went into it with the wrong spirit. I went into it thinking about this in terms of intellectual stuff. I didn't go into this thinking about the emotional labor it takes to do the intellectual work. That was a failing on my part. I had to admit that. And then after that, students had to figure out whether or not they were going to forgive me for that. The ones that did explained to me why they felt the way that they did. The ones that did told me what they would have preferred in that kind of scenario. And I just gave that to them the next time. And I asked them to promise me that if we had something like this happen again, you would stop me mid-sentence, mid-lecture, so that we can nip that in the bud so that we can go forward the way we should. I know some colleagues of mine, they would be a little bit too whatever to do that. They wouldn't want to concede the ground in the classroom because they have ideas about what authority is and what status is. I didn't care about that because what I saw that day was absolutely awful. And I didn't want learning to get hijacked through those kinds of things. But those were data points. That was information, and that information allowed me to make a fix to something in my own class. And as a general rule, I give opportunities for those interventions every other week in the classrooms that I do. So even if people aren't walking out, we'll have those sit downs and I'll ask people, like, what's going on? How do y'all feel about this? Is it landing? Do you want this thing this way? Should we do something else? And because I'm not too, dug in on one thing or another, it's easy for me to move these things for the needs of the student. And I think students notice that and they feel better and more encouraged to offer suggestions going forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Time for one more question. I'll do two more. I saw you, Chuck, before, and then Chuck Simone. Two more questions.
I was going to ask you one thing, but I've changed my mind after I've just heard you say this. And that is that I think one of the things that you're practicing in the classroom is humility. And that's not humility in terms of feeling bad about yourself. It's humility in terms of being able to be objective to yourself so that you can take criticism and use it as data. Yeah. You take so starting not with condemnation, right? But starting with interest. Wow, what happened? And I can tell you that when I first started teaching, it was hard for me to do that because I wasn't sure I ought to be there. But I think it's an example of a virtue, a teaching virtue that's really, really crucial.
Thank you. There was one question over here. I want to make sure that I get.
Thank you. I'm on the same page as you. And on the national level, there's conversation among universities about regaining trust from the public. And in an age in which there's so much digitization and quantification, a lot of the discussion is on making sure that students get a good ROI, a return on investment, making more. And so I would love to know, when faced with that argument, what can I say to them from your perspective that there's more to universities than ROI?
This is good. I don't have an exact answer, but I do have a sentiment. And that sentiment is this. A lot of Penn State, let's just take Penn State for example. Penn State is a land-grant institution. And as a land-grant institution, the rules are a little different here than they would be if this were a private, prestigious university. I'm not saying Penn State isn't prestigious. It feels kind of private, but it's a land-grant institution, right? Our job is to serve students in general and to serve students in our footprint in particular. As a political scientist, one of the things I've been dealing a lot with is that the job market is terrible for anything after graduation in that field. We have leaned into job readiness as a way of getting people prepared for what the world is going to serve them. That means skill building, yeah, right? But also it means being independent in thinking and being resourceful and being empowered enough to learn things that you're going to need that you might not have gotten while you were in college. In other words, having that flexibility professionally and intellectually is a really important thing that I think our discipline can give people. And we'll train people that'll go off and do things that their training wasn't in. And that's partly because we have real life stuff to deal with, but also because I think thinking critically and being a good communicator and being able to be uncomfortable with conflicting ideas are sort of hallmarks of my discipline. And we can give those to people, and those things can be marketable to people too. Yeah. Thank you.